Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Purpose Up podcast. Today, I am super excited to have with me Lodro Rinzler. Lodro, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So excited to have you. So, you are a meditation teacher. You run your own studios. You're an author. Tell us a little bit about all the amazing stuff that you do.
Sure. That's very kind of you. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting coming here on Purpose Up because, within this is like, what's the purpose? What's sort of the through line, the intention behind it? I would say that my work really does revolve around trying to make meditation as accessible as possible for people. And it started sort of really taking shape. I was born and raised in a Buddhist tradition. My parents started practicing Buddhism when they were in their 20s. By the time I came around, it already sort of been in the household for some time. And started meditating at a young age, but it was really when I sort of hit my late 20s that I started thinking really like there wasn't a lot of, gosh, how to say this diplomatically, a lot of like Buddhist texts and things like that didn't feel quite relevant and accessible for who I was in the 21st century as a young person.
Right.
There's a lot of really beautiful stuff out there in terms of Buddhism and meditation books. But, I remember reading through one of my people I admire very much is Pema Chodron. It's a longtime Buddhist teacher. And she opened one of her books with a story around um, coming home and realizing that she was getting a divorce and the deep heartbreak that revolved around that. And I thought, oh, I was going through a breakup at the time. I thought I've never been divorced. I've never been married, but I know heartbreak. And I thought, who's talking more about like that younger heartbreak, or who's talking not about that midlife crisis, but the quarter life crisis? And
Right.
the more I started thinking about that, the more I thought, if I'm not seeing it out there, maybe I can open the discussion around it. And that actually led to the first book, which was called The Buddha Walks into a Bar, and I've written 6 books total um, at that point, and teaching meditation more, and all of that led to the creation of Mindful, which is a network of meditation studios in New York City, as well as a video channel for people who don't live in New York. And we're just constantly thinking through this, like, okay, how do we make these very traditional teachings, things that have existed for 2,600 years plus, as available to people as possible? And that means that sometimes we sit here and say, oh, not everyone speaks, like, not everyone's a native English speaker here in New York. Like, maybe we should have classes in Spanish. Maybe we should, like, we're constantly trying to find new ways of opening doors so that people could have access to these really life-changing teachings.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that mission, and I think I definitely identify with needing that bridge between text that can probably seem a little bit intimidating versus something that's more approachable. So I think I love that mission. As a follow up, what have you found that works well for people to kind of get them in the fold and going?
Yeah, yeah. I feel like it's such an individual thing, right? Like for Mindful, for example, I should mention that all of our teachers are extremely well trained, but they all come from different traditions. So there's not one fold here, which is nice. It's like you could try Kundalini class in the morning and come back for a Buddhist class in the afternoon and end the day with Jewish mindfulness instructor. It's sort of, we have so many different traditions under one roof so that people could try a bunch of different styles and figure out what works best for them. And I think that's important.
Right.
In the same way that when I was a kid, someone handed me a violin and said, play the violin. And I did until I got bored and I put it down. But I always suspected that if someone handed me a violin and they said, try the drums, now try the piano, maybe I would have fallen in love with the piano and still been playing it to today. So we have that sort of mentality of like, see what, meditation isn't one thing. That's one of the big misconceptions.
Right.
Even to sort of zoom out for 10 seconds, I should mention that a big part of what we do here is just education around what meditation is and isn't.
Hmm.
Because it's words that gets thrown around a lot these days. When we say we have, traditional techniques offered in an accessible way, it's like these things particular techniques have been passed down for generations, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they have real integrity to where they come from. So it's really important to us that we have both, that it's like these teachings are really helpful and they've been proven over time.
Right.
And also, just because you tried mindfulness of the breath, which is a lot of what I teach, doesn't mean that that's going to be the jam for you. You might want to try loving kindness practice. You might want to try another type of practice, so that you actually fall in love with something and really find the benefit for yourself.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. for someone who is um, maybe tried meditation before, maybe they've picked up an app, or they've tried it and failed, quote unquote. What's the kind of recommendation for how they get back into it? Because I think a lot of people, including myself when I began, feel like, oh, I'm terrible at this, and they beat themselves up for thinking about other stuff, right? How do you encourage people to continue on when that frustration arises?
Great question. And I have like 5 answers swirling in my head, but I'll try and be clear and concise here. The first is, you mentioned that there's so many people out there that feel like, oh, I'm terrible at this, I must be failing at it. Either we're all failing and terrible, or we're all doing fine, right? Like, this seems like the gold standard is I have 60 to 80,000 thoughts in my head every day, and that's basically all of us. So it's not that we get rid of thoughts or turn our mind off, it's the fact that we have a different relationship to it. And here's the thing, the people who feel like I drifted off the most are actually the people doing it, working the hardest, you could say, to retrain the mind. Because here's how the mind works. We have these neural pathways, and in the rest of our life, we sit here and, maybe you and I are having a conversation and you forget, oh my God, I have to do this thing with my kid later, and your mind drifts off and you start going down this rabbit hole. And then before you know it, your kid's walking down, graduating from high school, and where are they going to go? Like, mentally, you could be 10 steps removed within a very short amount of time. Meditation is saying, okay, maybe that comes up in meditation, but you acknowledge it and then you come back to the stabilizing influence of the object of meditation, like the breath. So I'm sitting here meditating on the breath, and all of a sudden I'm projecting out about the rest of my day, and I acknowledge it and I come back. That is actually, like, the neural pathways that exist right now are the pathways that are meant for distraction and stress and all of these things. The pathways that we develop in meditation is, as we start to go down that road, we say, nope, we nip it in the bud, we come back. And the brain all of a sudden is creating new pathways that say, oh, I don't have to get lost in every stressful and anxiety-producing thought that arises. I could keep coming back to what's going on in the present moment. So the more we drift off and acknowledge it and come back, the more we're training the mind and rewiring the mind to actually be present in the rest of our life. So for those of us who drift off a lot, we're doing fine. Like, we're actually creating a different relationship. We're strengthening the critical system, which actually is commonly associated with positive emotional traits like empathy, generosity, things like that. We're actually creating a better relationship with ourselves simply by, quote unquote, correcting ourselves by coming back to the breath.
So, in other words, if I get distracted a lot, that's okay, and I'm not going to get distracted and beating myself up over it, but just coming back.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say this. This is only my theory. It's not something that is science compared to some of the other things I've been mentioning. But I think that, like, meditation practice, particularly mindfulness meditation, it gets this whole rep around, like, oh, you learn to be more present, and you do. But for anyone who's done this, that's only part of the equation because you drift off so much. So every time we drift off, we have this moment in our own minds where we could beat ourselves up, as you just said, perpetuate tendencies of self-aggression and self-doubt, and say you're getting miserable, you're bad at this. And that gets reified in the brain. Or in that moment, we actually say, I'm actually just going to be okay with who I am. I drifted off. It's not a big deal. Particularly in group meditation, I point out that everyone's doing it. Like, we're all in the same boat, of drifting off and coming back over and over again. So you say, okay, not a big deal. We relax. We treat ourselves with some kindness, offer ourselves a sense of unconditional friendliness. And that actually starts to get reified in the brain. We actually start to be nicer to ourselves. We actually start to develop more love for ourselves. And the more love we have for ourselves, the more love we have for others. So I think even something simple like mindfulness of the breath actually really does translate into us being kinder to ourselves and others.
Yes. And I think, just to underline that, the more that we are aware of those kind of self-defeating patterns, we can kind of short wire them, so we can kind of practice compassion. And I agree that is a game changer once you start to think about loving yourself. You can notice when you do or not, and that really helps one's evolution.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And it is. It's like, I don't want to shortchange some of the things that you're getting at, which is that meditation is hard. And we don't sit down once and feel like, oh, I'm forever peaceful because I meditated for 20 minutes once, right? Like, that's not how it works. I used the example of a musical instrument earlier. It's a similar path where at first, if you handed me a guitar, I wouldn't know what the hell to do with it.
Right.
I'd wouldn't know how to hold it. I wouldn't know how to strum the instrument. I wouldn't know how to play simple songs. But if I picked it up 10 minutes a day, played with it every day, over time it would become quite natural. After weeks, after months, I'd actually maybe be pretty good at it. So same thing with our own mind, that we just have to change the relationship with our own mind, but it takes time to do that.
Right. So let's say I've taken some time to do that, and I've got like a nice practice. What does one do once they've got a regular practice to amp that up, or turn the volume up on that to kind of go from beginner to intermediate beginner? And I'm
Sure.
sure those levels don't exist,
Well,
but
I get where the question's coming from. It's very funny, running meditation studios in New York. It's the only place in the world that I'll like lead an intro meditation class, and someone will say, "So what's the goal here?" you know,
what's the objective? Can we have some KPIs,
How do
please?
you, like, level up? Yeah, which I get it. I get that mentality. There's always going to be ways for us to deepen our practice, and I think the trouble is sometimes we feel like I've got to quote unquote level up. I've got to get better at this. When really what we're getting better at is getting to know ourselves.
Right.
So the more time we spend getting to know ourselves, the better it is. It's like a friendship, right? Like you see your friend once a week, you get to know them a little bit better every time. That's great. You see them every day, all of a sudden you know all about them. So same thing with our own mind. I think there's many ways to deepen our practice. Um, there is, for example, going from 10 minutes a day up to 20 minutes a day or even longer. That's a great way to do it. There's always books. I actually think study at home is a really important part of motivating oneself and keeping your practice fresh, because you're seeing maybe perhaps the same set of teachings, but through different eyes.
Right.
And then, of course, there's retreats. So going on weekend or week long or even longer, meditation retreats is a really powerful thing. My first weekend retreat I did when I was 11 years old, but my first month long I did when I was 17. And that really was the game changer for me. I'm a weird case, let's be very clear, because I was raised in it and all of these things. But, at the age of 17, not surprisingly, that was the moment I said, oh, this is different than what my parents do. This is my own thing now. I went to Gempo Abbey, which is a monastic community in Nova Scotia, and, took the robes for a summer and things like that. But like, it was not, my parents had never done the monastic thing, even though it was a temporary ordination. Like that's not something they'd done. And I was like, oh, my life is different. My path is different than their path. Not everyone needs to do that. I think even starting with a weekend is a really great place. And finding teachers that you connect with, these days, so many resources are online that one can go on YouTube and podcasts and things like that and say, oh, like I like this teacher. And many of those teachers have regular retreats across the world. And finding those teachers that you personally connect with, and then seeing they if they host retreats that you feel like you want to be part of. It's really a wonderful way to do it.
All right. And you mentioned some readings and books, and I know you're kind of have spent a lot of your time studying Buddhist texts. What do you recommend for the beginner wanting to, besides your books, of course, and I'll link to them in the show notes. But where do you recommend people get started there?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot out there, and I like to give a little bit of a smorgasbord, just because, similar to what I was saying before about mindful, like different people are going to find different entryways into the practice. So in the Zen world, for example, Suzuki Roshi's Zen Mind Beginner's Mind is a real classic text.
Right.
Sung Sun is a Korean Zen teacher who had written many books like Only Don't Know. That is also very lovely. I think um, Susan Piver is a really wonderful, she's a colleague, a friend. She's written many wonderful books, but her latest, it's not even her latest anymore. A book she did about a year ago is Start Here Now, which is really like the primer to launch a meditation practice, period,
Okay.
without necessarily being too sectarian about anything. So I always recommend that. I also think, for people that might want, they're like, I could never do mindfulness of the breath. Sharon Salzberg's Loving Kindness is still a classic 20 some odd years later, for a reason, because it is like the foundational text on like how to do this ancient practice that the Buddha talked about 2,600 years ago. So I think there's different ways, different access points for different people.
Right.
Some of us have the need to just settle, and some of us have the need to cultivate more love and all of that. So all of those are the ones that just sort of pop to mind immediately.
Cool. And then one thing that when I was just kind of in the internet world, you can go down different rabbit holes. I experimented with different audios to entrain the brain. Curious as to kind of your perspective on, those different entrainment methods for, meditation practice.
Yeah, can you give me an example?
So, I was listening to stuff that was either isochronic or binaural, and it was meant to kind of get your brain in an alpha or beta or specific state, kind of maybe quicker, faster than one could on their own.
Yes. Cool. So I'm going to say an unpopular answer.
Okay.
But I'm going to say it first with the caveat of science has actually revealed so much about how the brain works. And it's really sort of an interesting moment in time with meditation where East is meeting West. So everything from that down to just the basics of what mindfulness meditation will do for the brain. It's all being revealed. My unpopular opinion here is I always emphasize and recommend people to do practices that will ultimately shift how they operate in the rest of their life. Meaning, there are many wonderful practices, even practices we offer here at Mindful, that you lay down or you sit down and someone plays a crystal singing bowl and it actually induces this deep relaxation in the body. And that's wonderful until you go out to the rest of your world and you get an angry email from your boss and you're just as triggered as you were before you walked in. Right. So I think meditation is, that sort of meditation can be very helpful in terms of relaxing people into it and getting them familiar with it. But I prefer to recommend, this is me being diplomatic, I prefer to recommend this anyway, because that's important that people actually experience relaxation. I prefer to recommend techniques that are going to say, oh, I actually have been working with this sort of scenario while I was sitting on the cushion, and I actually have a different response than I would normally because I've been retraining the mind. So when I was talking about retraining, rewiring the brain and mindfulness meditation, even in stuff like love and kindness that I just mentioned, it's actually creating new neural networks that will help us in the rest of our life. We have this term meditation practice.
Right.
We're actually saying I'm practicing for the rest of my day. So instead of using meditation as a way to just, feel good or to do deep relaxation, to do it as a way that we become more familiar with who we are and we start to actually change how we live the rest of our life as a result of what we learned in meditation. I think that's very interesting. Not to put that other style down. I just think that there's more that could be done in some of these very traditional, long-standing techniques.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the practices one of my objectives, and I feel like bad using the word objective, but I'll have some self-compassion, is to better understand my intuition, and kind of turn the volume up of that and turn down the volume of external validation. I know meditation is great for that. How would you describe it, I guess, in terms of your experience of how one gets more in touch with their intuition versus the kind of monkey mind?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's funny. I was actually reading some research that says even just doing that initial body scan that so many of us do as we enter meditation starts to move some of the energy from the left side of the brain, which is associated with monkey mind and repetitive thinking, into the right side, which is, this is overly simplistic, but it's prelingual, it's pre-verbal, it's pre-linguistic, I should say. It's actually more somatic. And the more we're able to relax the body, the more we're able then to relax the mind. The more we're able to relax the mind, the more clarity there will be. So I do think that there's something really important to these very basic steps. But, in guiding these things over the years, I'll say, and in my own personal experience in my practice, that aspect of really relaxing the mind and body is a good entry point to the point of intuition, because we sort of need to settle. So even doing mindfulness of the breath for a few minutes before we do, for example, a guided contemplation really makes a world of difference, because we have actually allowed the mind to relax to the point that we notice what is neurotic thinking and what is intuition or our gut or our wisdom mind, however we want to talk about these things. But, actually settling the mind through mindfulness of the breath and then moving into, for example, what am I grateful for today? Or what is my intention for today? What qualities do I want to cultivate in myself today? These sorts of questions actually then we notice that little voice that's within us, as opposed to these sort of swirling thoughts that often feel like they're bombarding us, just by simply creating more space through the entry point of mindfulness.
All right. I like that explanation. I think you touched on this at the beginning, but how do you think, you were talking about your purpose in terms of making Buddhism and meditation more accessible to younger people. Do you still kind of view that as your purpose? And then, related to that, how do you think about purpose in general?
Good questions. Yeah, I think, it started with me being a young person and then saying, I want to make this accessible to young people. And I think at this point, here we are many years later, where my work is more widespread, and it's also not just young people, but disenfranchised people, people who don't normally actually have access to teachings like this. There is an issue within a lot of meditation culture in the West that is primarily white and primarily middle class or upper middle class. So trying to reach more people of color, trying to make it, something like mindful is thankfully very diverse and inclusive community that includes trans people, includes people of all sexual orientations and gender identities and ethnicities, races, you name it. So really trying to, when we say make meditation accessible to everyone, we really do try our best, I would say, to do that work. As opposed to just saying, well, let's get more young people in the door, right? I mean, our youngest member here is 9 years old, and our oldest one is 91.
Oh, right.
It's great, and it has that sort of intergenerational feel, which is important to me personally. Even though my starting point was very much like, I'm a young person, I want to talk to other young people. It's actually grown over time. So I think that sort of sense of purpose, the through line is still there of let's make meditation as accessible as possible to everyone. But the skillful means has changed dramatically. It used to be, okay, I'll write a book. And I was like, I'll write a book and I'll do online trainings and I'll travel a lot and all of these things. And now I have to say I'm entering a point, like mid-30s. This sounds ridiculous to say because I'm still young, but we've trained a lot of wonderful teachers here at Mindful, and I feel like I can't be everywhere, and they're out there doing really important and interesting things in terms of making meditation accessible themselves. So I feel like there's a good army of open-hearted warriors who are out there doing, as my atheist brother would say, doing God's work, like trying to help people through these practices. And it's not just me. Mindful isn't just about me at all. It's about the 40 teachers that are here, of which I'm just honored to be one.
Great. And as not to put any pressure on you, but I was on a hike with my buddy this morning, and we think about the impending doom that this earth is coming across. And I don't know if you saw the New York Times magazine that was this past weekend, where it was just basically a recap of why we're too far gone in our ecological crisis. But how do we accelerate this kind of this peace and love before it's too late? And how can we keep our heads calm and clear while so much of where we're at right now is so hectic?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, we could talk ecological crisis. We could talk rampant racism and hate. We could talk any number of very big and seemingly insurmountable issues that our society faces. And I mean, yours it's an excellent one. Like, how does meditation ever help with something that big? How do we accelerate it, right? Like, how do we magnify the power of, as you said, peace, love, these wonderful qualities that one could cultivate in these practices to make a real difference in the world? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the unfortunate part is that it's very slow, and the fortunate part is that everyone can do it.
Right.
I really believe it. That it's, one of the teachers I've had over the years used to talk about how society isn't some big thing out there. It could be two people sitting down and having tea. So it could be, you go over to a friend's house, that you and your friend go for a hike, and you have this meaningful conversation, and it has this ramification of, here we are talking about it, and then we have this conversation, and maybe there's listeners who get chance to hear this conversation, and then they sit down with their friends or their family that night and talk about how to sort of have a positive impact on the world. There's a ripple effect. Of course, I don't think you sat down here saying, I'm going to have a ripple effect right now. Like, that's not how it works. Like, we just start to show up for our lives differently if we've been practicing meditation. In the same way that you could have ended up just sort of staring at your phone the entire time and not really talking to your friend during your hike.
Right.
And you could have, talked about all the hot celebrity gossip and all of this. Like, that would have led to a very different conversation, probably a very different energy of you and I sitting down here today. And that conversation would have gone in a completely different direction and affected people that listen to your podcast, right? So this is how society works. It's not something out there. It's us. It's like us constantly co-creating society. So by simply showing up for ourselves, showing up for others, showing up for meaningful conversation, I really do believe that we shift the overall dial in terms of this ripple effect. And there's an old Robert Kennedy speech where he talks about throwing a stone in a pool of water. Initially, we see the ripples, but we don't actually get a sense of where all the ripples go. We can't see it.
Right.
And that's exactly that, It's exactly what you just proved by going on the hike and talking about something meaningful that you both really care about.
So I know you hold space for a lot of people who suffer and kind of bring this mindfulness practice to them. What are the biggest challenges in doing that as someone who holds that space, and what are some of the greatest benefits that you find from that?
That's a great question. One of the things that I did in my last book, it was called Love Hurts, and it's a book on heartbreak. And it was a very vulnerable book to write about because I talked about a lot of the difficult times I've had in my life as well. And in it, I talk about a time where I called up a friend, a dear friend of mine. I said, I don't think I'm ever going to love again. This was the last big relationship for me. It was a broken engagement. My fiance left. I don't think it's going to happen. And I know I'm being foolish. I just need you to tell me. And he said, I know you, and I know that you'll love again. And it could be many people. It could be one person for the rest of your life. It could be friends, but I know that that's who you are and what will happen. And it meant the world to me. And I put in that story in there, and I said, if you feel this way, here's my personal email address. And you email me your phone number, and I'll call you, and I'll tell you the exact same thing. And I would love to tell you then that, that was the end of it. But I called someone this morning. I call someone almost every single day because people email me and they just need to be reminded, excuse me, I'm tearing up just thinking about how many people out there just I'm alone and I just will never love. And so it's a privilege to call them up and to hold space for them and just reassure them, really, I get it. And I know you will. I know you'll heal. I know that what you're going through is impermanent because everything is impermanent and that's just the way things are, even if it's hard right now. But it's a lot. And I'll be completely transparent. I think sometimes people say Buddhist teacher and they think I'm not a human being or something.
Right.
I'm very much a human being. I have foibles, and at some point you should interview on a podcast my wife, and she will tell you all about them. And I think there's a lot of messiness to being human. I think there's a lot of genuine heart to being human. And I think it's sort of when I reach out to those people, there's a genuine understanding of I'm only able to hold space for you because I've also been through something. So I think there's a lot of shared humanity that is getting uncovered as I try to deepen my work. And a lot that I'm still learning in terms of how we could make meditation accessible to people, because there's so many blind spots that I have as cisgender, white, heterosexual male.
Right.
That there's so much more work to be done in terms of trying to make these practices accessible to all beings.
And if people wanted to help participate in the cause, how do they help this mission?
I think the best thing would, I have my website, which is lodrorinzler.com. The nice thing of having a name like that is that you always own the domain names.
It's a lot better than Ben Stein.
Yeah, right. That's true. And then similarly on Facebook and Instagram and things like that, I'm Lodro Rinzler. And then, people can always come to Mindful. It's MNDFL Meditation.com. Someday we'll be able to afford the vowels, but we're still a startup. So MNDFL. meditation.com. And similarly, if people do not live in New York, there's Mindful Video on that site. So you can actually watch guided meditations from myself and from all of our expert faculty in guiding you to whatever you would actually like to practice with.
All right. Anything else that I didn't cover today that your intuition is telling you that the audience needs to know?
No, I mean, I think it's wonderful that you're doing this work and that you're talking about purpose. And it is, in today's society, it's a really important time to actually be sending out something other than here's more bad news. So I appreciate that you're doing it.
All right. Well, thanks again for taking the time with me. Really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with me, and look forward to diving into all the resources that you recommended.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care and talk soon. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Purpose Up with me, Ben Stein. Please subscribe here on YouTube so you can be updated on when the latest episodes come out, as well on Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you consume podcasts. And since you're still sticking around, I've got a special free gift for you. Just go to purposeup.com/free gift or click this link here to get book recommendations from me, a guided meditation, as well as a book I wrote on how to live your life more purposefully. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I really appreciate it and you.